Hi, everyone. Welcome or welcome back. So, today I want to talk about the process that I went through while I wrote my first book. Specifically, my book is a memoir. I want to share some of the emotions that came up, the thoughts that kept percolating throughout my mind, and how I kept writing even when imposter syndrome constantly crept in throughout the process. So, if you're new here, this channel is for fellow recovering people pleasers. I use real moments from my day to day life to reflect on what worked, what didn't, and what I'm learning as I try to deconstruct fawning and live more authentically. So, I have always loved reading and writing. I remember writing stories when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old and leaving the public library with a stack of like 10 books in my arms, trying to figure out which one I was going to read first. So, one of my goals since really I was a teenager was to become a published author. And for a while, I thought I had accomplished that when I published my first academic manuscript and I was first author on it. That was incredibly exciting at the time, but really over the years, I realized I wanted something more. I really wanted to write a book, something that was relatable, but I also wanted it to be something that could kind of shift people's perspectives or make them pause and think differently about the world. So I have always been drawn to memoirs. I've always liked those real life experiences that are paired with deep introspection and have a universal message that most of us can relate to. That kind of book. So I decided to write a memoir about my 2 years working as a researcher in a women's prison. So it's braided with my own experiences navigating dating and relationships combined with the stories of the women that I talked to. I knew that writing a book would be hard, but I naively thought, well, it's just a memoir, so I'll just write what happened and that'll be about it. I was very wrong about that. Writing nonfiction, especially memoir, it's not for the weak. It brings up a lot of emotions and a lot of self doubt. It forces you to confront parts of yourself that you usually don't show anyone. And you start overthinking how every sentence, every reaction, every scene that you write, and especially every behavior that you might do, you think about how it's going to be perceived by others. And don't get me started on the imposter syndrome. I had questions in my mind like, can I even write a book? I don't know what the heck I'm doing. I've never done this before. And honestly, it's probably a recovering people pleaser's worst nightmare to think that you are going to be judged for something that is your own and something that comes from your voice. But for me, it was very necessary to write about my life and to write a book. It became a massive exercise for me in deconstructing my people pleasing and sort of loosening my grip on what other people might think of me. It did take me a couple years to really even get started. I had an idea for it and then I just kept putting it off. And one reason why I think it took me so long to start was that every time I outlined my ideas, I would just get all of these different thoughts and they would spiral. I'd have thoughts like, do I even have a right to write a book? Like, who am I to think that people would even want to read my story? Is it narcissistic or even vain of me to want to write about my life? I would think I haven't really done anything that interesting. Memoirs are written by people that have done interesting things. And honestly, what helped me was surprisingly simple. I just started telling people that I was writing a book. I didn't say things like, oh, I'm thinking about it, or I might. I said, I am writing a book. And when people asked me what the book was about and I explained it to them, they sounded genuinely interested. A lot of people, they were my friends and family, but really, even that small validation made the project feel real to me. And even when someone didn't seem that interested, then I just tried to reframe that as data or information. Maybe they're just not the right audience for my book. And I think people pleasers, we struggle deeply with allowing ourselves to take up space and expecting that people will listen when we speak. I highly doubt that men are asking themselves the same questions when they decide to write a book. Us women are often taught that talking about our experiences is selfish or indulgent. And that belief quietly reinforces misogyny and patriarchy. Because if we don't tell our stories, others will continue telling them for us. And I realized that while pieces of my story existed elsewhere, there were stories of women in prison, stories about dating, stories about people pleasing. No one had yet braided them all together. And even if they had, no one had told it in my voice. I realized my voice is unique. And more than that, my voice mattered. So instead of asking myself, should I tell my story? I started telling myself, I have to tell my story. And once I started writing, I began to see it as less of a performance and really more of a practice. It was actually quite therapeutic. It really helped me understand my past more deeply, my people pleasing behaviors, my assumptions about women that I interviewed in prison, and really made me see the shared humanity amongst all of us. And that part, especially digging into my background, that was extremely difficult, if I'm being honest. There were moments that I didn't want to admit that maybe when I interviewed women in prison, I had been judgmental toward them. I didn't want to admit that my people pleasing sometimes came from believing that I was actually better than other people. And I didn't want to believe that some of my own sexual trauma hadn't been fully resolved, and I still needed to do some work on that. And eventually, I reached a point where I realized not writing this would actually be a disservice, not necessarily to other people, but to myself. And I also reminded myself that this wasn't just my story, it involved the stories of women who are often ostracized and underrepresented. And that realization was kind of a double edged sword. On the one hand, it helped quiet the thoughts I had about this is narcissistic or this is selfish. But on the other hand, it did raise ethical questions. Who am I to tell these women's stories? Shouldn't they be the ones to tell their own stories? Shouldn't they be able to make those decisions? And that's why I was extremely intentional about things like changing names, identifying details, and different characteristics. I wanted to make sure that I protected the people that I was talking about. I tried to focus on sharing experiences amongst women rather than just individual ones. But still, that tension never fully disappears, and it probably shouldn't. That should be something that we're constantly asking ourselves, especially if we're telling other people's stories. There was still imposter syndrome throughout the writing process. And another wave, I guess you could say, of the imposter syndrome came from logistical concerns. So I would ask myself questions like, can I actually write a book? And can I write it well? I've written manuscripts, but I've really only written academically. People, they go to school for creative writing, they study it for decades. So why did I think that I could just come on in and just write a book all on my own? And eventually I realized that formal education is valuable. I mean, I have a PhD and I find it very important to be able to have credentials. But I'm realizing that it isn't the only path to learning. I could do things like take classes, I could hire editors, I could read more of the type of book that I was trying to produce. And I could also practice, I could write a lot more. I learned that there's many ways to build skill, and that's okay. I was also terrified of how people might judge me if the book were ever published. But I realized that if I obsessed over every possible interpretation from every single person that read my book, I would never finish it. And I'd also be contradicting the entire message I was trying to convey in this book. When I thought about memoirs and the novels that I loved the most, I didn't love them because the protagonist was perfect. I loved them because they were human. They were messy, they were nuanced, they were women like me. And that realization helped me break my writer's block. The book didn't have to be perfect, just get it down on paper or on the computer. Recovering people pleasers, we would rather not do something at all than do it imperfectly. But published books aren't perfect either. And if I tried to erase my imperfections, I realized that I would erase my voice. I learned that honesty and messiness are far more interesting than perfection. Some of the most compelling characters, the characters that I love to read about, they're flawed, they can be really frustrating and annoying, and they might also be slow to learn. They might need to mess up a couple times to actually learn their lesson, but that's what makes them human. Characters that I love, those messy characters, they're just like me, and they're also like you. Now, if you want to share, I would love to hear where imposter syndrome has shown up for you and how you have dealt with it. And if this resonated, feel free to like or subscribe so that you don't miss future reflections on boundaries and recovering people pleasing. Thank you guys so much for watching and being on this journey with me. We will continue to deconstruct people pleasing one moment at a time.